Chamber Astartes, a Primarch's throne. History made. Fabian was getting used to associating with the Lords of Humanity, and he viewed the coming meeting with more curiosity than fear. He and Diablo were installed in their scribing booth, in the raised gallery over the gate, before the great and good were admitted. The menials, who had been rushing about to finish preparations, left in twos and threes, and for a short while the Historitors were alone in the Chamber Astartes. The Chamber Astartes was a large cupola atop the superstructure of the Dawn of Fire. From his position, Fabian was able to look across the room and into the void beyond. Tall Gothic arches of plasteel filled with armor-glass made up the walls. The pointed roof was also transparent. The floor was inset with zodiacal designs, describing the superiority of humanity. 3/4 of the chamber's circuit housed stepped benches, 1/3 part of those oversized to accommodate transhuman attendees. At the leading edge of the dome was a giant throne, the Primarch's seat, awkward seeming, for its great size had been designed to accommodate the armor of fate. A raised stall held 10 more thrones, suited for humans. These were for the Council Ex Terra, representatives of the High Lords in Fleet Primus. Another seat, also large, was close at Guilliman's left hand. This for Stratarchis Tribune Actuarius Maldavar Colquan of the Adeptus Custodes. Finally, a third human-sized throne was provided for Primus Fleetmaster Isaish Kestrin, this one raised up so that the top of it was level with Colquan's, and only a little lower than Guilliman's. There was a fourth station at the front, though this was not a throne, but a series of sockets chased in gold for Archmagos Belisarius' call. All was as yet quiet. Diablo was busy cross-checking his notes, a preparatory habit Fabian did not share. Most of the last night, by the ship's reckoning, Fabian had been learning all he could about the Cardinal and Shrine world of Gathalamor. Such a big imperium, he was discovering, such a depth of history. In his old role at the Departamento, he had thought he knew far more than most, and had looked down on the masses ignorant of the past. He knew better now. Looking out of the windows at the majesty of Fleet Primus unmanned him. 26 battle groups were arrayed in great formations against the velvet void. There was the world they orbited, a nameless ice giant about a pale sun, whose swollen moon followed it closely. Cracks were visible on the ice covering the world's seas. The potential for life beneath in the water, the power of the world's sun, feeble as it was, the thousands of ships, the endless night and billions of stars. The size of reality was overwhelming. Names on scrolls were all Fabian had ever seen in the past. He had known nothing. He was nothing. His hand strayed to the amulet around his neck. "Forgive me, O Emperor," he thought. The sheer scale of things dismayed him, the numbers involved. Gathalamor was only one of 1,000,000 human worlds. It was settled over 10,000 years ago. It had hundreds of gargantuan cathedra, a population in the billions. On the main pilgrimage route to Terra from the galactic south, it had become an important place to the imperial cult, a world where countless of his holy servants were interred in vast necropolises, whose catacombs totaled hundreds of thousands of miles in length. Trillions of pilgrims visited the world. Untold wealth was generated there. Gathalamor performed a crucial role in the structure of the Adeptus Ministorum, being the seat of a cardinal responsible for the spiritual welfare of dozens of subsidiary systems. Old, rich, and strategically important, there was nevertheless a stain upon its history. The renegade Cardinal Bukharis had come into power there, unleashing the so-called Plague of Unbelief upon the galaxy. The details were scant, as much had been suppressed, and it had been thousands of years ago. More deranging numbers, more history on top of history, and the story itself was frightful. "Does it not disturb you?" Fabian said to Diablo suddenly. "What?" The Voidborn looked up from his notebook irritably. His neck was so thin inside its brace, Fabian feared it might break. "The history of this place we're going to." "You mean Cardinal Bukharis?" Diablo frowned. "I suppose so. It is a horrific tale." "You suppose so? He enslaved hundreds of worlds to feed his own vainglory. His faith turned to greed." Fabian shuddered. "Do you not think he is worse than most of the monsters in this galaxy because of that?" "How so?" asked Diablo, though he made it clear Fabian was disturbing him. "He used belief against the Emperor," said Fabian. "I know he was only a man, but the fact that he was not something more powerful makes it more shocking somehow." "Perhaps," said Diablo. "But men do not have to be able to bend steel in their bare hands to do great harm. I have found that evil wears whatever guise it deems best, Fabian. Xenos, demon, or deluded mortal, it doesn't matter." His pen scratched loudly. "The story is never simple. Look beyond the tale. Think about the consequences." "What do you mean, Diablo? Lucaris was a bad man." "I mean," said Diablo, "what is good and what is evil is subjective. It is decided by the victor." "You're not condoning him, are you?" "Absolutely not. But consider that before the Cardinal made his great folly, Gathalamor was a poor backwater. Without the macro-cathedrum he built and the shrine to Confessor Dolan, who helped overthrow Lucaris, Gathalamor would have remained insignificant. Now the faithful flock there. It is one of the richest planets in the southern segmentum solar, and a great bastion of the imperial faith. History is rarely simple. You could argue that evil was the making of that world, and therefore evil leads to good, sometimes." "Then the corollary is that good can lead to evil," said Fabian. "Unfortunately, yes," said Diablo. He went back to his work. Fabian shook his head. "I was so ignorant," he said. The scratching of Diablo's pen stopped again. "Perhaps you should prepare for this meeting," he said tersely. "We do have a function to fulfill here." "You and I are different, Diablo," said Fabian. "I need to order my thoughts in my own manner. By interrupting mine, each to their own, I say, but I wish you could do it quietly." Fabian let him be, and sat back down. He grimaced. The gallery was fine to look at, but painful to occupy. There was not enough room to sit with his legs out in front of him, and his knees rubbed on the back of the box panelling. As this was heavily carved inside as well as out, it was highly uncomfortable. A low, mournful blast sounded from the horns mounted beneath the gallery, making the wooden structure shake. A babble of voices followed, and men and women began to stream into the chamber. "It's beginning," said Fabian. He reached for his writing materials. "Then look sharp, Historitor," said Diablo. He closed his notebook. "History is about to be made, and we are the ones to record it." Chapter 7. Lords of Fleet Primus. Xenos. A warning. They came in then, the great and powerful of Fleet Primus, the group masters, generals, bureaucrats, captains, magi, admirals, and all the others in their braided pomp. The purr of power armor insinuated itself into the babble of voices as Space Marines clanked in and took their places. Lucerne had said that while on campaign, Space Marines performed all their duties in their battle plate, in case the need for action arose. Occasionally Fabian would see them in robes, but they were hardly less daunting unarmored. The Space Marines arrived en masse, and took up their oversized benches together. Armor of clashing liveries made a lurid display, more so as each one of the giants was bedecked with honors. Collectively, these men had millennia of fighting experience, for they were veterans of long standing, and there were only a few of the Primaris type among them. For the time being, the Space Marines of Call's Gift were firmly under the command of the older sort. Fabian noted all this down in shorthand on parchment. His data slate read his hand movements and recorded it in its simple mind. The slate read the words and passed commands to a small drone, fashioned in the shape of a hound's skull, and this hovered amidst the flock of cyber constructs growing under the dome, recording audex and taking picts to supplement the Historitor's work. Diablo had a skull of his own, and their unique paths revealed the preferences of their masters. The chamber was almost full when a hush fell. It was so pronounced that Fabian half rose to peer over the edge of the gallery to see why, and found himself looking directly onto the head of Stratarchis Tribune Maldavar Colquan. This being, striding now towards his throne, his Auramite armor casting scintillations across the stars, had stood in the presence of the Emperor himself. He had seen him with his own eyes. Fabian felt nauseous at the thought. He fell back into his seat, shivering, and was gratified to see the tribune's arrival had had a similar effect on Diablo, who sat, pen motionless, as Colquhoun took his throne. Call clattered in next, accompanied by his own swarm of servo-skulls and sundry other devices. He stopped and exchanged words with others coming into the room, like an old man in a district market, and not one of the most powerful beings in the Imperium. Colquhoun took off his conical helm and rested it on his knee, revealing a face so judgmental Fabian couldn't look at it. When he tried to sketch it, his trembling fingers refused. Call slithered to his input dock and pressed his bewildering array of limbs into the sockets. When the rest of the audience had filled the benches, trumpets sounded, and the chanting of priests welled up from the corridor outside the chamber. In came a solemn procession, shrouded in clouds of incense, vomited by skull-faced cherubim. Behind the priests went 9 of the lords of the Council ex Terra. Swathed in clouds of scented smoke, they took their places in their stand. Militant Apostolic Gistan, a truly ancient creature who represented the Adeptus Ministorum, creaked to his feet and began a lengthy blessing. Fabian tasked his cyberdrone with recording it while he watched the reactions of the people gathered there. They ranged from boredom to rapture. Colquhoun stared ahead stonily. Call seemed occupied with some business of his own, though he performed it with respectful quiet. Most of the mortals in the room bowed their heads. The Space Marines waited, their engineered faces blank. Eventually, Gistan sat back down. The priests left, and Guilliman came in. The Primarch arrived with only 2 Ultramarines of his Victrix Guard. He strode with the purpose of an efficient man who finds himself unusually busy. The guards peeled off either side of his throne, where they stood to attention, bolt guns across their chests. Guilliman turned about, gathered up his cloak, and sat down. He was enormous, but his presence outdid his physical size, his soul pushing at them all, as if there were not enough room in the chamber to contain him. "My lords and ladies," Rabute Guilliman said, without preamble, as Fabian had come to expect. "We find ourselves delayed. Some of you are aware of the reasons why. For those of you who are not, I shall now explain. Shortly after leaving Vorlesi, our psychers reported a building disquiet about the coming battle for Gathalamor. These range from visions interrupting astropathic communication to repeated identical spreads of the Emperor's Tarot observed by the fleet cartomancies. Those who know me well know I do not put much stock in such scryings, but they have been consistent enough that we must assume something is amiss. We have had no message from the holding force I deployed upon the world. There is, according to our seers, a rising disturbance in the warp occurring around the system that is barring communication. Our prognostications were dire, but imprecise, so I sent for aid. That is why we came out of the warp. The herald of the one I petitioned has arrived." He looked around the room. "The nature of this herald will appall some of you. You will not voice this opinion. You may feel the need to show your loyalty to the Emperor by displaying aggression. You will not. You will receive this emissary with cordiality, and you will listen to what he has to say with respect. He and his people are not to be harmed while they are here. Any man or woman who takes it upon themselves to act against our guests will be found out, and they will answer to me." He asked for no understanding, but looked around the room again, silently conveying the sincerity of his threat. "Provost and Iramus, please bring our guest into the chamber Astartes." The sound of a single set of marching feet approached, though 2 figures emerged into Fabian's view. The first was a high-ranking judge of the Adeptus Arbites, resplendent in white armor. The second Fabian took for a man, though only for an instant. It had a humanoid shape, 2 arms, legs, and a head. Its body was proportioned similarly to a human being's, but not the same. It was too thin, too elegant, but beyond its form, its manner of movement gave it away. No man or woman walked so precisely. It moved soundlessly, despite its trailing robes and the dozens of angular charms hanging from cords all about its armor. Then there was the smell, spicy and sweet, faint and not unpleasant, but the revelation it brought made Fabian recoil. "Xenos," he said. His hand stopped moving across the page. He was not the only one to voice the word. Xenos. It whispered around the chamber. Colquhoun tensed, even he unable to disguise his shock. He didn't know, thought Fabian. The alien's gear was outlandish. A tall helm with a curved, forward-pointed crest, huge eye lenses of deep green, reminiscent of an insect or a deep-dwelling fish. It wore a dull gem upon its front as big as Fabian's fist, carried a tall staff topped with a geometric symbol inset with another gem, this one shifting with a treacherous light. At its waist was a bizarre gun with a flaring back and a fluted snout, and a slender power sword. Fabian looked on in horror. It carried weapons in front of the son of the Emperor. All his life he had been told to loathe the alien. Here was one in front of him, and it was armed. Hatred was his automatic response. Whispers hissed around the gathering. "You will be silent," Gilliman said, and the voices dropped, though the tension remained thick. The arbitrator went to his place among the other lords of the council. The Xenos approached the front of the room. Gilliman did not move. Fabian felt a sick panic. This thing could strike at any time, and yet Gilliman did not move. The Xenos stopped before the throne and performed a complex series of gestures with its hands. Black robes rustled, but still its charms did not rattle. It bowed, and then, to gasps all around, it dared make the holy sign of the Aquila. It reached up and unclasped the front of its strange helm. Its gorget shrank back into the high collar of its robes. Fabian could not see its face yet, but had an impression of a long skull, pointed ears of near-translucent flesh, and a high topknot of black hair, fine as silk. "My greetings to you, Lord Gilliman, son of the anathema, humanity's hope, my people's hope, our ally, our friend." It spoke Gothic flawlessly, but with a musicality that made the words seem vile. "Eldrad Ulthran sends his greetings to you, his old and valued friend." It got down on one knee. This was done stiffly, unlike all its other movements, as if the alien had to force itself to kneel. Viablo recovered his wits first. "Right," he hissed from behind Fabian. "Write down what it says. This is important." "You are well received, Farseer," said Gilliman to the alien. Then he addressed his generals. "Lest any one of you believe that this noble guest of ours interferes in the affairs of humanity without cause, let it be said again that I called upon his master, and that he comes here knowing of the danger it represents to him. If you cannot look past his heritage, then at least acknowledge his courage, and hear his message." Gilliman rose from his throne. The alien was tiny compared to the majesty of the armoured Primarch, yet, weirdly, he seemed apart from him, as if they did not occupy the same frame in time and space, and in that he appeared even more dangerous. "Rise," said Gilliman. The Xenos stood and turned around. For the first time in his life, Fabian looked a member of another intelligent species in the face. It appeared to be male, though its features were androgynous, pinched, with a sharp chin like a child's, and a blade of a nose. Its eyes were too big for its face, and almost completely black, with only a hint of white in the corners. It was a caricature of a human being, drawn by someone trying to accentuate human beauty, and failing, making it ugly and hateful instead. "We welcome you, Ilion Natase, of Craftworld Ulthwé," Gilliman said. He pronounced the name strangely, speaking like the alien did, and that struck Fabian as grotesque. "Lords and ladies of the Imperium, I greet you in return," said Natase. The sense of loathing that emanated from the audience was palpable, yet the Eldari stood firm in front of it. "This news I bring you, I saved for your ears. Even your Primarch, Lord Gilliman, has not yet heard all that has come to pass. Firstly, I tell you that your empire persists on the other side of the rift." A murmur went around the room. "My kind are at war there, as are yours. This—" A Commodore of the Navy shot to his feet. The Eldari turned his disturbing face towards him. "Lord Gilliman has already confirmed that Imperium Nihilus stands." The alien cocked his head. "Is this true?" he he asked the Primarch. Gilliman inclined his head. We learned not a few weeks past. An unreadable expression flickered across Natasse's face. Then that is ill news. The Skeen suggested you did not know. Not only do we know, said the Commodore. After the first news, we received many messages from the far side of the rift, some of which detailed military actions by your people against ours. Uproar broke out in the chamber. And I do not speak of just any faction of your perfidious kind, but the black-clad warriors of Ulthwé, shouted the officer over the tumult. Murderer! Xenos scum! They cannot be trusted. We have never trusted the Eldari. Not only a Xenos, but a Xenos witch. Silence! Boomed Gilliman. His voice was a weapon that slew all complaint. Quiet fell instantly. I told you to hear him out, said Gilliman. Without his master, I would still be trapped in stasis. Do not forget this. He turned to Natasse. Perhaps we are not so helpless as your people sometimes believe, Gilliman said. His words fell into the silence like dropped iron bars. Perhaps, said Natasse blankly. Fabian could still not read his expression. He was cold, lacking human emotion. Though our seers are more skilled than yours, for this reason you should listen to me, he said. Why should we? Said a voice from the Council Exterra. Luthien Zyle, Kiliarch of Rasunian, and designated representative of the Lord Commander Militant of the Astra Militarum. Gilliman turned towards him. Because I say you should. Would you defy my command, Lord Zyle? But, my lord, we cannot trust them, protested Zyle. I accept full responsibility for saying this, but someone must speak out. Sweat trickled down from beneath Zyle's shako. He shook with the effort of looking the Primarch in the face. Many of us here have fought the Eldari. I admit that they have been our allies at times in the past, but only when it suited them. Then you are saying that they brought me back because it suited them, said Gilliman, neutrally. His words covered a dangerous gulf. Zyle bravely stepped into it. Yes, he said. Call chuckled to himself, as if he were amused by a private joke, or communicating with someone else and not paying attention to what went on in the chamber. It was the Emperor's will that you return, said Zyle. He used them as his instrument, but the Eldari are not selfless. They did not do it for the sake of humanity. They are cruel and cold, and regard us as little better than animals. I know. I have faced them on the battlefield. I have spoken with their leaders. This is the greatest military force the galaxy has seen since the Emperor left Terra and retook the stars. Why do we need them now? You are right, said Gilliman, and though he continued speaking as if he addressed his fellow humans, his words were meant for the Eldari. I have known Eldrad Ulthran since the days of the Great Crusade. He and I have made common cause more than once, but I do not trust him. I do not trust one of them. We fight to save our species. They fight to save theirs. It is an evolutionary struggle, and in that there can be no true friends. I know that if their prognostications demanded it, they would do all they could to wipe us all out without a second thought. I suspect some members of some of their nations have tried. He looked at the Farseer. Know, Natasse, that although I extend to you full hospitality, and I swear you shall not be harmed while you are here, and that I have great respect for Eldrad Ulthran, I know your kind. Choose your words carefully. Speak truth if you can. He loomed over the Farseer. Know that although the Lady Yvraine and Farseer Ulthran were instrumental in bringing me back, I will not be manipulated by any of you. Zyle is correct. The wrath of humanity is roused like at no other time. We could crush your species, root and branch, if it pleased us. He looked around the room. But it does not please us to do so. For too long the foes of chaos have been foes to each other, when they should have been allies. Both human and Eldari stand on the precipice of extinction. The galaxy teeters on the brink of annihilation. Now more than ever, our goals are in accord. That is why these people brought me back, because the Eldari know they cannot win without us. Without mankind, they are doomed, while we need all the aid we can find. Some have likened we Primarchs to weapons, he said. And it may be that the cabal of sorcerers who rule their peoples thought to employ me as one. But be aware, Eldari, if I am a weapon, I was not one made by your kind. I have a will of my own. He turned around and went back to his throne. There he sat again and raised his hand. Now, tell us what you came to tell us. Natase waited, as if all this talk were the jabbering of ill-behaved children. He cast his alien gaze about to see if any more disobedience was coming, then spoke. You risk disaster at the Gate of Bones, he said. The skein reveals a confluence of dire events. A psychic storm brews at the world you call Gathalamor. Could this be an attempt to extend the rift, as we saw at the Makorta Sound and elsewhere? Primaris Psyche Lady Philomencia Blas spoke now, the representative of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, an old woman whose spare frame hid immense power. She addressed the Eldari directly and earnestly. Natase cocked his head at her. You have seen this. I have seen something, she said. You are strong in the warp, but your skills are poorly refined. My species had been using the Sea of Souls for tens of millions of Terran years before your ancestors had even evolved. It was our undoing, and because of that, we know its currents better than you. This is not an attempt to tear time and space and let out the waters from the other sea. We have witnessed a great outpouring of horror emanating from a point in time exactly 26 days from now. The way I can describe it to you, in your limited tongue, is of a stirring of souls and a betrayal of faith. Souls living or dead, said Blas. Your division is superfluous to our eyes, but you would call it a disturbance of the dead, said Natase. This is preposterous, said the inquisitorial deputy, Arfan Hoyditma. He was small, dark-skinned, with yellow eyes of ferocious intensity. Is it? Said Blas. Are the holy powers of the Emperor a joke to you too, or the vile sorceries of the archenemy? This being may be a creature of dubious truths, but he is powerful. She turned watery eyes onto Natase. I can feel it. He is a witch, and a Xenos, and though you are only a witch, Hoyditma said, you are still a witch. In a certain sense, our astropaths are witches, our navigators, many of the people we rely on to maintain the Emperor's most holy realm, said Gistan. He smiled, his face wrinkling further. They are touched by the God Emperor in order to be ordained fit for their purpose. Lady Blas has stood in his presence and withstood his power. Can you say the same, Inquisitor Hoyditma? The Inquisitor looked away, muttering. This is difficult for you to understand, said Guilliman, even though many of you have faced the agents of the ruinous powers in the past. But I must make it clear that we are not fighting armies alone. We are fighting gods. It took my brothers and I far too long to understand this in the last great war, and it almost cost us everything. I do not make the same mistake twice. He paused. Zyle, inform us of the current military strength present upon Gathalamor. Call seemed to find interest in the conversation, finally. If I may, he said pleasantly. A limb unfolded from his back. Eyelid shutters clicked open over a lens, and a hololithic display of the Gathalamor system spread below the dome. Call frowned at the large number of cyber constructs floating through his image, and let out a binaric screech that scattered them. Much better, he said. My thanks, Archmagos Dominus, said Zyle. Not at all, said Call. Zyle nodded. Then we shall take a look at the last reported strategic... I am happy to be useful, Call said. Belisarius, warned Guilliman. Of course, said Call. I shall be quiet now. Continue, Kiliarch Zyle, said Guilliman. and speak freely in front of Farseer Natase. Let him see the power of the forces at our disposal as a token of trust." "My lord," said Zyle, "I cannot—" "Freely and openly, Kiliarch," said Gilliman. "As you will," Zyle said reluctantly. The system of Gathalamor floating above the gathering was a number of worlds around a healthy orange star. "As we are all aware, Gathalamor is one of the key warp nexuses that have come into being since the Great Rift opened," said Zyle. "Most of the principal warp routes employed for the last 10 millennia have been greatly disrupted, and new, strategically vital confluences of fast currents have come to rest beneath different planetary systems. Of the 8 proximate to Terra, 7 are currently in the hands of the enemy. All, in fact, except Volesi. Olmec was supposed to be taken by Fleet Tertius before it was diverted to the Macortus Sound, though Tertius should now be en route to that world, and we expect news of its taking soon. Fleet Quintus was designated to fall upon Lysira, but was delayed. Indeed, with our layover here, the Crusade, as a whole, finds itself in an overall state of delay." He paused. "Gathalamor is home to one of these nexuses, and the key to Fleet Primus's breakout from Sol. The plan was to take it, then divide Fleet Primus into battle groups, enacting simultaneous strikes in conjunction with Quintus and Tertius across multiple theatres in this segmentum and the segmentum Pacificus, while Fleet Secundus took the slow road to the Eye of Terror. Problems with Quintus and the diversion of Tertius mean that plan hangs by a thread. If we are successful here, then it may be the initial strikes of Tertius and Primus may still be somewhat coordinated. Having secured these relatively peaceful parts of Imperium Sanctus, then the Crusade would have been able to accelerate territorial reacquisition." He paused for effect. "If we do not take Gathalamor, that plan will fail. Furthermore, by revealing our assets, piece by piece, we will have given the enemy time to reorganize his disposition, making any new plan hard to formulate and enact." Zyle gestured at the cartograph. "Please magnify Gathalamor Prime, Archmagos," he said. Call obliged. Gathalamor grew. Its sister worlds sped away, out of focus. There were only small military presences on the planets of the Gathalamor system when the enemy attacked, the Kiliarch said, it being distant from all war fronts before the Great Rift opened. At the giving of the Lord Gilliman's order, all assets were redeployed to the primary world. Other forces were redirected from nearby war zones. These include a division of the Astra Militarum from Mordian, principally the complete 84th Regiment, supported by numerous smaller elements from the same world, and the Fyrox 40th Armoured Regiment, a force of over 2,000 fighting vehicles, taking total estimated Astra Militarum forces there to double brigade level. The other primary fighting forces present are multiple preceptories of the Sisters of the Argent Shroud, some of whom make Gathalamor their home, along with a number of other smaller formations, most notable of which is 5 full lancers of House Camidar Questor Imperialis, and their sundry support elements. Zyle continued, reeling all the figures off from memory. That gives us 250,000 infantry, 3,000 tanks, and a few dozen war engines of medium scale and above, give or take. "Can you not be more precise?" asked a groupmaster. "He cannot, sir." An adept of the Departmentum Munitorum turned around in his seat and replied for Zyle. "There are no Adeptus Astartes present?" "None," said Zyle. "None were close enough. Our best outcome was that this force hold the world until Fleet Primus arrived. Obviously, we are present in such overwhelming strength that any conflict for the system will be short. However, as directing our efforts from a ruined world would be difficult, the orders to the holding force were to preserve it at all costs. But we are late, and the enemy committed to the campaign with greater numbers than anticipated. Reports give a grand battalion of the Iron Warriors Traitor Legion in system, including fleet assets and allies. Those who did not know the situation on Gathalamor began to speak among themselves, and Zyle had to raise his voice. "That is not the worst of it," he said. "The last astrotelepathic communication is sorry reading. The Iron Warriors' arrival was accompanied by mass cult uprisings on Gathalamor itself. Our forces were taken by surprise by traitors from within, and at the time of the last communication had lost over 2/3 of the planet's surface to the enemy. More conversation flared up. "What about fleet support?" asked another groupmaster. "Could we bring in more reinforcements? Could we drive off the heretic Astartes void ships and strand them there?" Dogan May, Rear Admiral of the Navis Imperialis and ex-Terra Council representative, got to her feet. "Fleet elements have been withdrawn. The remnants of Battlefleet Gathal were insufficient to oppose the enemy. They were ordered to withdraw and regroup at Necromunda. It was deemed better to save them than lose them." "Then they're fighting with no void support," said another. Gilliman spoke again. "I do not ask that men and women give up their lives lightly, my lords, but the purpose of this force is simply to buy time, to save a world humanity might live upon still, and keep the enemy's eyes away from the stars and our approach. When we arrive, we will destroy them, no matter their strength. It is the portents that give me concern. Eldrad Ulthran's warning only makes what we have seen in our own scryings more worrying. If the enemy were to destroy the balance between materium and immaterium, or deploy some other manner of sorcerous weapon, then our attack could end in disaster. Our greatest strength is our weakness here. Fleet Primus will crush any mortal foe, but that is not all we face, and if there exists a means to oppose us, then the whole of Fleet Primus may be in danger. For the time being, we can assume our movements remain obscured from Abaddon's sorcerers. Wherever forces of the Crusade have struck, they appear to have been unanticipated. With Fleet Secundus moving on the Eye of Terror, the War Master's attentions will be elsewhere. We must also assume that we cannot rely on this situation persisting. Gathalamor must be taken. We cannot afford to tarry. And so I hereby amend our plans thusly. We shall send ahead a small party in a fast ship to determine the situation and report back. They will also have my leave to intervene should the need arise. This force will leave tomorrow. We shall depart a day behind them. Depending on the vagaries of the warp, they should have between 2 and 6 days before the remainder of the fleet arrives." He turned to Colquan. "Tribune Colquan, this effort will be led by the Adeptus Custodes and supported by the Adeptus Astartes. Select your warriors now. We cannot delay. Come what may, Fleet Primus must take Gathalamor before the month is out, intact. The Emperor demands it, and time is fleeing before us." Chapter 8. Safe Haven. Sanctum Miraculous. Canoness Imelda Veritas. Dvorgin's party reached the outer pickets with minutes to spare. Whistles shrilled from glassless windows. Yenko replied with the day's coded responses. Once past the sentries, they picked up pace. The city was less damaged closer to the void port, and the going became easier. Mordians called out to their general from foxholes. Dvorgin made a point to salute all who saw him before their officers ordered them back to silent watch. Every so often, they passed heavy weapons teams occupying scratch bunkers ringed with sandbags. The bunkers were laboriously broken down every day, the bone dust in the bags tipped out, and the positions moved. Attack from the void or the air was unlikely so close to the port's defences, but sometimes heretic Astartes patrolled the ruins in place of cultist rabble, and the Imperial forces had little to counter them. The void port and its district occupied a range of low hills, bounded by the Canyon of Countless Blessings to the west and the ocean to the north. The eastern approach was a tangle of steep, narrow streets climbing carved cliffs, the stair that gave the area its name. Only the south presented an easy way in, and there the Imperial defences were the most complex. Even though the gradient was shallower than on the other 3 sides of the hills, it was only relatively so. Mordians moved double time when they could, the men trying to smooth out their gait so as not to jar the wounded they carried. Dvorgin feared for all his injured men, but Kesh most of all, and at the checkpoints on the first and second trench lines he nearly lost his temper. Nowhere was there Medicase support to be had. They would have to get back to base for that. Within the inner lines, signs of loyal civilians became apparent. Scattered bonfires in broken buildings at first, where the survivors burned the remains of the sacred dead to survive. Then whole ragged encampments, thousands strong. Those remaining on the surface were truly desperate. Most had taken to the relative safety of the catacombs. All were under suspicion and watched closely by the troops in case insurgents hid among them, drawing more men away from the front. Bombardment struck up in unpredictable patterns. The echoes produced by Gothalamore Impresentia's streets made judging the direction difficult, but Dvorgin was certain they were pounding the western approach again, at St. Cletus Span. They took a raised expressway that led directly to the Ascension Stairs' main landing mounds. These grew on the horizon once Dvorgin's group gained the plateau, beehive lumps illuminated by the flash of artillery firing from the landing fields. Nothing attacked the voids that night, so they were spared the nightmare displays of displacement discharge. But as midnight approached, Dvorgin's party had to pass through the sickening barrier themselves. Dvorgin took a deep breath before stepping through. Cold fingers teased out the stuff of his soul. Some of his men rushed off to vomit once they were past. It took an effort of will for the general not to follow suit. Only when he had the warp barrier to his back did Dvorgin allow himself to relax. The void port was as safe as anywhere on the planet. Ahead, the Sanctum Miraculous rose up, 600 feet tall, guarding the route to the port's heart. There was a roadblock across the highway. Helm lenses glinted in the dark. "General," a voxmitter spoke from the shadows, "we offer our praise to the suffering Emperor that you are returned safe to us." A trio of battle sisters manned the barrier. All three wore the gunmetal armor and white robes of the Order of the Argent Shroud. Their leader had the hood of her flakweave habit pulled up over her helmet. "Palatine Gracia Emmanuel, is that you?" Dvorgin asked. "What are you doing on guard duty?" "You think this too lowly a task for the Canoness's second?" she asked. "We all must serve." She looked over the wounded. "I will escort you," she said, indicating that her sisters should remain. "I can find the way," Dvorgin said. "Of course, General," said Emmanuel. "But allow me to give what little aid I can. Your soldiers are tired. I can clear the way for you and summon help. I know you are proud, and you should be so, but embrace humility for a short space, so that you might have the succor you require more rapidly, and so return to the Emperor's war refreshed." "Praise him," said Dvorgin, abashed. Technically, he outranked this woman by many degrees. That didn't stop her being right. He bowed his head. "And forgive me." "You need no forgiveness. Praise for him is all we require," said the sister. "Come." She turned and led them down off the expressway by way of a cast ferrocrete stair, adjusting her pace so that the wounded Imperial Guardsmen could keep up. At the bottom, they entered the sanctum via a large arch that led into an entrance vestibule. A thick gate at the back barred the way inside. Dvorgin waited while the sister proceeded with the necessary security. Her helmvox clicked as she communicated with her fellow sororitas within, and occasionally she spoke aloud to the machine spirit guarding the gate. Dvorgin wasn't familiar with this entrance, but he could have gained access himself, as could his officers. He was in command, after all, but he was grateful of the rest, and the opportunity to go to his injured warriors it brought. Many were fading. Such were the sacrifices the Emperor demanded, and those who had died had done so with honor and courage. He could ask no more than that. Dvorgin's own wounds bothered him, but he paid them little mind as he went to offer quiet words. He would have a Medicae attend to him only after they had seen to his guardsmen. He made himself leave Kesh until last, for he thought he might spend all his time with her if he did not. "You look pale, Guardsman Kesh," he said. He tried not to stare at the bloody bandage at her side. "We're all pale, sir," she replied, her voice a hoarse croak. "We're Mordians. Night world, sir. We're supposed to be pale." Dvorgin couldn't suppress his bark of laughter. Still, he could see that Kesh was growing weaker, despite her bravado. If they didn't reach a Medicae soon... The last check was passed. The door gave out a brief trumpet blast, and it sank agonizingly slowly into the ground. "We go within," said Emmanuel. She was serene in all she said and did, and though armored in heavy gear, she made it seem as if it weighed nothing at all. "Your soldiers require Medicae attention, rations, resupply, and rest. I will see to it." "Thank you," said Dvorgin. "I mean you too, General. You must also be seen to," said the sister. "Every wound is a test of faith. The devout endure," said Dvorgin. "I can wait. I must meet with the Canoness." "Does he not say Better to heal the sick and bid the wounded walk, so that they might serve me again, countered the sister. Follow, she said, and led them down a sloping passageway. They clattered down long runs of marble stairs into the stone corridors of the upper catacombs. There were many chambers there, most occupied by dead-eyed civilians huddled around braziers. Other spaces contained caches of arms, stacks of crates under oiled tarps, or stockpiles of rations and clean water. One chamber had been repurposed from a shrine into a church, where armoured Adeptus Sororitas knelt in prayer alongside the ragged people. Another was a morgue, with shrouded forms stacked one atop the other along its walls. The sisters were present in some numbers, ministering to the faithful, and guarded the major junctions in ones and twos. A thick plascrete wall barred the way, a small door set into it. They had reached the reinforced foundations of the inner sanctum, beyond which was the domain of the military alone. The checks proceeded more quickly now they were inside. The door opened. On the other side there were many people, mostly administrative staff of the planetary government. Dvorgin heard the familiar strains of a cask organ ahead. Only the folk of his world played those compact instruments. Only Mordians knew the words to "I carry him with me in shadows and light." He'd not been this far down before, but he recognized the room layout from the plans. This area was given over to the 2nd Battalion as barracks. Your men have a field hospital that way, the sister pointed down the corridor. I will see to it that Sisters Hospitaller attend also. Come with me. Later, said Dvorgin. I cannot convince you? Dvorgin gave a tired smile. Duty first. If you insist. The Hospitallers will be waiting to see to you. I thank you, Palatine Emmanuel. I will mention you in my prayers tonight. He went to his party and gathered his officers. See to it that everyone is treated, he told them. Inform the quartermasters that all from the recon group are to be issued double rations by my command, and that the machine spirits of your weapons should be honoured. Return to your own barracks if you are able. I'll expect a full situational appraisal and personnel roll call by the morning. Pass on your recommendations as to who should be entered into the book of Mortis Honoria to Colour Sergeant Kedesh. The lieutenants saluted, clicking their heels together smartly, and herded the exhausted Mordians away. Dvorgin heard the cask organ stop abruptly, voices raised in greeting and calls for the medicae. His cuts stung. His body ached. He wanted nothing more than to follow Emmanuel's advice, join his soldiers' reunion before sinking into his bunk for a few hours' sleep. But that was not command. Dvorgin pushed exhaustion aside. He took a flight of steps. By then he had a good idea of where he was. Life in Mordian's labyrinthine hive cities gave all born there an unerring sense of direction, and he headed upwards, out of the underworld, to the Sanctum's high command chamber.